Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Wa alaikum salam.
Thank you so much, Imam Rashid, for having me speak at the Claremont Mosque and for inviting me to the wonderful community here. Also, thank you to Brother Farid Sayyid for connecting me to the mosque. As Imam Rashid mentioned, I'm a Kashmiri American, which means that I was born in Kashmir and spent some time there as a child before the conflict forced my family to seek refuge elsewhere. We ended up in the United States, where I've lived and studied since, but I do go back home every year and have spent significant time conducting research there. It's not my first time in South Africa, and as an American, being in this mosque and in South Africa in general is always very eye-opening for me, because it has shown me what is possible for Muslim communities. While of course I'm aware of all of the struggles that you are dealing with, be it race, sectarianism, or the struggle for greater and more advanced gender parity in the country and in your community, the confidence that South African Muslims exhibit in being Muslim, and just being Muslim, in your wholesome identity, your sense of belonging and larger acceptance in the society is something that American Muslims really struggle with. Since we are in the middle of a test match, to use cricket terms, we are always on our back foot. So it has been really uplifting for me to see and witness your confidence and to see what is possible. But today I will be talking about the history and the current situation in Kashmir. I think the topic is especially important for a South African Muslim audience, not only because many Muslims here have ties to the Indian subcontinent and have traveled there, but also because the Muslim community here is active and has long been involved in struggles for solidarity, for peace and justice. For instance, I know that the Palestinian Solidarity and the Boycott, Divestment and Sanctions campaign against Israel is very active here. And the South African Muslims partake in charity and humanitarian efforts and have played seminal roles in the anti-war efforts when it came to the invasion of Iraq. At the same time, however, there is less of an awareness of what is happening in Kashmir, and I will get to some of the reasons for that, why that is the case. But I hopefully can make a case that helps you understand the issue better and perhaps assist in taking action when and where you can. I know that we are in an age of too much information, too many crises, but I think as Muslims we have to continue to remain informed and conscious about all of these issues, be it Kashmir or the Rohingya or Yemen or the Central African Republic, because so many of these injustices are interlinked in terms of the systems of oppression that enable them to continue to happen. You cannot understand one without understanding the other. As many of you may have heard before, our beloved Prophet Muhammad ﷺ once compared the Muslim Ummah to one body. He said that if one part of the body is in pain, like the eye or the head, then the whole body is in pain. And if you look around the world today, Muslims are not just in pain, but we are deeply, deeply wounded, gasping for air in so many places. But many of us only know about some parts of the body that are wounded, but not about others. There is a hierarchy of care. The parts that we care about are influenced by our race, the color of our skin, nationality, religious sect, or political sentiment. Even worse, in some parts of the world where our presence is particularly vulnerable, we are taught not to care, to shut our eyes, and to only worry about certain Muslims or certain people, or to use the Prophet's analogy, only a part of the body that most impacts us. To not see ourselves as a global community of believers, and to let our national identities take precedence over our collective humanity. Of course, this will not help us heal. To heal this body, we have to know everywhere where we are wounded, and we have to know how that wound is connected to all of the other wounds in the body. And so, let me tell you about the wound that is Kashmir. Many of you have heard of this place of mountains and lakes, of beautiful embroidery and shawls and art. You might have heard of the poetry of the Mughals and their opulent praise of the valley. And it's all true. It's a place of extraordinary beauty surrounded by barbed wire and army bunkers. Our Himalayan peaks are capped with snow and 700,000 troops. More than in any other part of the earth. More than double the combined number of US troops in Afghanistan and in Iraq. First, for the basic geography. Kashmir is located between India, Pakistan, and China. Pakistan controls one part and India controls the other. Kashmir is home to Muslims, Hindus, Sikhs, and Buddhists, but Muslims are in the majority. The most common misunderstanding is that Kashmir is a territorial dispute between India and Pakistan. But for Kashmiris, this is not the case. At its core, this is a struggle for the people of Kashmir to be able to determine their own future. Most people trace the history of the conflict in 1947, when the British left the Indian subcontinent to be partitioned into India and Pakistan. But the Kashmir issue actually goes back to almost 2 decades before. In 1931, Kashmiri Muslims launched their first ever agitation against the Dogras, who were a Hindu monarchy that ruled over Kashmir since the mid-1800s. At the time, the Muslims were poor and uneducated and were discriminated against by the Dogras. So they were calling for a more representative government and for better economic and educational opportunities. At the time of partition, Kashmir had the option of either acceding to India or Pakistan. But the situation was complex because Kashmir was a Muslim-majority region and its ruler was Hindu. The Dogra ruler hesitated, and there was a rebellion against him by local Muslims, which was heavily quashed. As a result, a tribal army from Pakistan came to liberate the region's Muslims. The ruler panicked and went to the new government of India to ask for military help. India agreed and said that they would provide assistance as long as the ruler agreed to accede to the country. The Dogra king signed the treaty, which promised that the state's future would be determined by reference to the people. It also said that India would only have a say over the defense, communications, and foreign affairs of the region. Otherwise, Kashmir would have significant autonomy in all of its other affairs. Both India and Pakistan went to war in 1948 over Kashmir, which resulted in 2/3 of the state to be controlled by India, while 1/3 was controlled by Pakistan. India took the dispute to the United Nations, which called for a referendum in which Kashmiris would be able to determine their own future. To this day, the referendum has not taken place, and this remains the crux of the issue. Instead, the Indian government spent the years between 1947 to the late 80s eroding Kashmir's autonomy, installing corrupt and repressive pro-Indian governments, and quashing pro-Pakistan or pro-independence sentiments in the region. After failing to get the referendum through constitutional means, and because of the realignments in global politics after the Iranian Revolution and the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, Kashmiris took up arms in an armed insurgency. From the late 1980s to the early 2000s, Kashmir was embroiled in an uprising between Kashmiri and foreign fighters against the Indian state. The insurgency was supported by Pakistan. Of course, a small band of rebels was no match for the Indian state, which violently quashed the movement. During this time, over 700,000 Indian forces became part of the permanent landscape of the region and remained there until today. During the militancy, between 60,000 to 80,000 people were killed and 8,000 people disappeared, and there are still no answers to what happened to them, whether they are dead or alive. In addition, countless women were raped by Indian forces. It seemed that for much of the 2000s, things were quieter in Kashmir, but in 2008, a new wave of largely non-violent protests began to emerge, calling for azadi, or freedom from Indian rule. They were led by the generation that was raised during the period of heightened militancy. These were young people in their teens and 20s, the opposite of your born frees, if you would like a comparison. And they were fed up with the militarization, the routine killings, and the level of oppression. Since 2008, almost every year, there has been an upsurge in violence for months at a time. 2016 was the worst, and I'll go into what happens in 2016 to give you a sense of what happens during these periods of heightened violence. Because of the crackdown on dissent and no steps being taken to resolve the issue, a small group of young Kashmiris have once more turned to an armed rebellion. They are being killed by the dozens. This year alone, over 200 of them were killed. India, of course, is doing its best to position them as terrorists, but these are young kids who are simply frustrated and driven to fight. In July of 2016, the Indian forces killed 22-year-old Burhan Wani, who was the most popular of this group of rebels. Burhan had joined militant ranks when he was just 15 years old, after witnessing his brother getting beaten up by Indian forces near their home. For nearly 7 years, he absconded the forces and achieved a folk-like status, with tales being narrated of his narrow escapes from the forces and his Robin Hood-like generosity towards his people. Few people know that Burhan never actually killed anyone, but so strong was his symbolism and his act of defiance that he was India's most wanted man. After news of his killing spread, there was collective mourning throughout Kashmir. Hundreds of thousands came from all over and defied curfew orders. In fact, 4 janazas had to take place to meet the number of people, and there were funeral prayers in absentia all over the region. After his death, there were protests throughout. Protests in Kashmir are similar to those in Palestine. Crowds of young, unarmed boys, some who carry stones and to throw at Indian soldiers, being met with live ammunition at times, and most recently pellet guns, which, when fired, shoot small but high-velocity lead pellets into the skin and damage internal organs. Many of these pellets were fired into young people's faces, resulting in nearly 1,500 youth who became blinded and 15,000 that received injuries in 2016 alone. It is important here to know that the Israelis train the Indian police forces and they share tactics on how to effectively control crowds. Again, to think of how all of these systems of oppression are interlinked. The deaths or injuries that occur as a result of one protest lead to another protest and the cycle continues. In the meantime, the entire region shuts down as pro-freedom groups call for strikes during which businesses, offices, and schools remain closed. The state also preemptively calls for organized protest, preemptively cancels organized protest by declaring a curfew in the region, with strict shoot-on-site orders. The 2016 agitation lasted for nearly 7 months. So you can imagine, people were not going to work, many in the working class were struggling to make ends meet, and children were not attending school for that entire time. But of course, no one in the West bats an eyelash for these children who aren't attending school. In addition to brutally quashing protests, Indian forces also enter into neighborhoods, arresting and beating those who they believe are stirring the agitation. They work with a strong network of local informers, many of whom are forced to work for the occupation as a result of financial need or fear for their lives and families. They regularly arrest youth who are involved in stone throwing or participation in protest, many of whom are under the age of 18. These youth are booked under the notorious Public Safety Act, which effectively brands them for the rest of their life, even if they are released. During their detention, they are subject to torture, including electric shock, sexual humiliation, and other tactics that are also used by the Israelis. There's also a plan by the government to build Israeli-like settlements in Kashmir in a bid to change the demographics, to make it less Muslim. Now keep in mind that all of this happens with complete impunity for the forces. They are mostly protected from prosecution. The state also clamps down on communication networks, sometimes for days or weeks at a time, including phones, messaging services, and social media. This is all happening in what is called the world's largest democracy. At some points, there are also economic blockades that are imposed, and no essential goods reach Kashmir for weeks or months at a time. You might wonder how people manage to survive under such conditions, but Kashmiris have learned to be resilient. Many of them, including my family, have their own vegetable gardens in their yards. Daily life in such a militarized and repressive society is not easy. Most people, not just those who have lost family members, are suffering from PTSD, depression, and anxiety. Their only solace, as many of them will tell you, is faith, is holding on to a belief that this world is temporary and that maybe they will be rewarded in the hereafter. Unfortunately, unlike other places in the world that the Western powers have specific interests in, mainly revolving around natural gas and oil, Kashmir doesn't get the attention it deserves, and there is little interest to resolve it. With Pakistan so evidently unstable, no state and no institution will pressure India to grant Kashmiris the right to choose. Kashmir also has a lot of water, and both India and Pakistan need that water. Beyond the ideological reasons and its strategic position, it's also a battle for resources. So why has this issue not received international prominence? India is theoretically the largest democracy in the world, has a strong diaspora who simply thinks it's a country that can do no wrong, a large consumer base, and a developing economy, and the largest factory of dreams called Bollywood that cultivates the imagination of people around the world, from the US to UK to Australia to Senegal to the Caribbean. The Muslim, Dalit, Christian, Kashmiri, or Northeastern minorities cannot compete with the soft power machine that is India. And unfortunately, most Muslim countries, with the obvious exception of Pakistan, which has its own interests in the region, rarely bring up the issue because they do not want to undermine their business ties with India. Now, in the particular context of South Africa, as many of you may know, India and South Africa do have very close ties, and of course with BRICS, these ties are only going to get stronger. India is able to use its soft power in such a way that unfortunately Kashmir remains a blind spot for many activists who would otherwise speak out on the issue. I would like to end my talk by suggesting a few things that you, as South African Muslims, can do for the people of Kashmir. The issue is stuck in limbo, but the people need solidarity from the outside to put pressure on the respective governments. The first is simple. Inform yourselves and others about what is going on. A handful of Indian and international media do cover Kashmir, Al Jazeera English being one, and The Scroll in India. Informing yourselves will allow you to amplify Kashmiri voices here. Incorporate the issue during your social justice events. Connect with Kashmiris who are on the ground. Plan an activist solidarity trip to Kashmir and hold your leaders accountable on their relations with India. If there are steps that are being taken to create greater ties between the two countries, use that as an opportunity to raise the issue of Kashmir. Write about it for your papers and change the narrative. India has so far managed to get away with its actions in Kashmir, but having more international scrutiny will make an impact. Jazakallah for your time and attention. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala forgive us for all of our sins and heal our community wherever we are hurting. Ameen.